Hi, everyone. We're going to be waiting for everyone to tune in and log into our talk for today. As I see you guys rolling in, I am going to be asking you guys if this is your first time joining the IC Talks. We like to see where everyone is tuning in from. Feel free to, in the chat feature, to type in which city or country that you're tuning in from so we can get an idea where everyone's coming in from. Before I introduce my guests, we're going to go over some housekeeping items. So if this is the first time you're joining our IC Talks, the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists, we're a community of journalists that encourage press freedom globally. And our aim with our IC series is to connect journalists at a time when it's difficult really to do so in person. So with these one-on-one conversations, we're really aiming to dig a little deeper and create an opportunity for you to have direct access to our guest. So we hope you learn, grow, and take away from today information that will help you, inspire you in your work going forward. So the format's really simple. The guests and I are going to have a conversation. We have the chat and Q&A features open. So please make sure that in the chat portion, you leave any technical questions or concerns. My co-chair, Dan Kubisky, he's going to keep an eye on that for us. The Q&A portion is for you guys, the attendees, to ask our guest questions. Once we have your question, we will unmute you and you can ask the guest directly. If you prefer that I ask the question for you, please make sure to make a note of that and I'll be more than happy to do so. And I also want to remind everyone that the talk will be recorded and placed into our YouTube channel for those that can't tune in with us live. We'll provide that information in our emails after the end of the week. So now our guest, we have today with us Gavin Phipps. He's the morning news anchor at the ICRT, the English language radio in Taiwan. Gavin first came to Taiwan in the late 1980s and witnessed the island's transition from single-party rule to a democracy. As a journalist, he's covered a wide range of Taiwan issues over the years, contributing news stories and feature articles to numerous publications about topics as diverse as Mandopop and presidential elections. He has worked as a full-time reporter for the China News and Taipei Times newspaper in Taiwan. He served as a Taiwan correspondent for Billboard magazine in the late 1990s and was the Taiwan correspondent for Jane Defense Weekly from 2007 to 2017. He has been with ICRT since 2006, and we are very honored to have you with us today, Gavin.
Yeah, good morning, good evening, hello, wherever you are.
So right now for you, it's in the morning, correct?
It's 8:04 in the morning, yes.
Beautiful, precise. So Gavin, I'd love to learn more about you and what's the current situation in Taiwan when it comes to press freedom.
Press freedom, there we go, there's a bit of an issue. If you want the official version, I shall begin with the official version, if you want the official version, because according to the official version, which is compiled by Reporters Without Borders here in Taiwan, which has an office, basically, Taiwan was ranked 43rd on the World Press Freedom Index this year. Now, that's actually, in fact, down one slot from last year, but according to Reporters Without Borders, the one notch lower didn't mean anything because apparently that was to do with the way they organised their rankings. If that's what they said, that's what they said. But apparently Taiwan is only one of 4 countries in the Asia-Pacific region that fall into the good and fairly good categories of the index. And they're followed by New Zealand, Australia, South Korea. Basically, there you go. So Taiwan is 43rd. So according to Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières, or whatever it is in French, basically political interference in the local media is rare and less tolerated. However, Taiwan's journalists are suffering from a very polarized media environment dominated by sensationalism and the pursuit of profit, much like any other country that has newspapers.
Right. So what for
That's
you?
The official version. That's the official version.
So what's the unofficial version from the Gavin perspective?
The unofficial version is like every other country. Taiwan has a biased media, seeing as unbiased media really doesn't exist. We have pro-KMT news channels on the television and we have pro-KMT newspapers. We have pro-DPP newspapers and pro-DPP cable news channels.
Okay. And how has that process been for you you've had such a varied career being with different organizations? What has that been for you when it comes to doing coverage in Taiwan?
You make full use of your remote control and you channel hop.
Oh, really?
And you look at several different newspapers.
Amazing.
Recently, let's take an example. Recently we had the presidential elections here. Before, in the run-up to the presidential elections, one particular party fielded a candidate, and one particular newspaper, these will remain nameless for my well-being, was running like what you'd call editorial stories on the front page. They weren't news stories, they were like editorials, which is an example of what certain media outlets do here in print. And there was a couple of cable news TV channels that got into trouble, basically, with the media watchdogs for basically blanket coverage of certain candidates and less coverage of other candidates that they didn't favour as much.
Okay. And so you've been in the country for, is it safe to say more than 30 years? Over 30 years? Makes
me sound really old. Let's just cut 10 out and say 20. There we go.
Yeah,
that's a nice round number. 20.
We'll take 20. So what took you out to Taiwan, and what got you to stay there and do the journalism work that you're doing now?
I lived in Hong Kong. I got tired of Hong Kong and I got on an airplane and came to Taiwan because I knew people here. In a nutshell, very simple.
Yeah, and what was the initial push to get into journalism in the first place? Did you start in Hong Kong, or was there a backstory behind that?
No push at all. I sort of fell in a hole. Literally fell into it and it smacked me in the face, and this is where I ended up. I didn't go searching for a great career. Had I would have done, I would have probably gone into the financial sector because I'd be a bit richer than I am now, if you see what I mean.
Oh, that's hilarious. So what are the differences that you're seeing from the time when you first started in Taiwan to now? Are there differences?
Maybe I think I've been here too long to know it's any different. There are differences, of course. You know, you walk down the road and it's different. The environment's different. There's also more media outlets now, of course, because when I first came here, there was like basically terrestrial television with 3 news channels. And and as Dan will remember, the national anthem at midnight when television shut down for the day. Right. But now, of course, there's a lot more.
So, like, the audience was different at that time, right? People were tuning in, and now, are you seeing that the change with, with the internet and these different outlets and online?
Yeah, there are a lot of online media outlets here in Taiwan. Of course, you get the YouTubers as well doing their take on the news. I should admit, I don't really pay much attention to them, seeing as I'm old-fashioned and believe in the old-fashioned print media and the regular cable news channels, or the regular, what used to be the terrestrial news channels. I think the stuff on the internet is best avoided at the best of times due to the fact that it's full of sensationalism and, to coin a phrase, just complete, absolute made-up rubbish. But that might just be me.
So is it safe to say that you're not a big fan of social media, or do you also look to that for news sources?
Being incredibly antisocial, I don't have anything to do with social media whatsoever. I'm telephone and email and the odd text message.
Amazing.
Which is ironic considering I live in Taiwan, which is a hub of sort of tech brilliance, you could say.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, I think for some people that are tuning in, Taiwan is kind of a mystery. What could you tell them about Taiwan that they may find surprising?
Bubble tea. What's surprising about Taiwan? It's an island off China that nobody recognises, but you don't know that anyway, surely. So what's surprising about Taiwan? People are friendly, but then people are friendly all over the world, depending on who you meet, I guess. That's a bit of a difficult question. I really don't have an answer to it. I do apologise.
Oh, no. I mean, so as of, being a foreigner going into the country and being a reporter, did you find any differences or challenges and obstacles, and how were you able to overcome those?
Not really, no. I wouldn't say there was, of course, there's language problems, of course, and there's, etiquette problems, which they would arise in any country, I guess. Yeah, like working in any country, you have to deal with this. But, it's going to sound really inane to say this, but as a foreign national being a reporter in Taiwan, I find you can walk into government offices, both central and local government offices, and talk to a lot more people without an appointment, because you walk in and they're willing to talk to you, which happens. Of course, sometimes it doesn't happen, but I have walked into a lot of places just completely off hat because I have to write a story or something. And 99.9% of the time, I've actually spoken to someone who, if I'd gone through the process of trying to arrange an interview with them, it would have probably been a pig's ear, and I would have had to wait 4 months if got the interview at all.
Oh, wow. So is that the case the past few years? With the relationship between...
No, that's been the case for over 20 years.
Amazing. So when you see what's going on in the US and around the world when it comes to the interaction between government officials and the press, what is your perspective on that? Seeing that in Taiwan, there's a little, like, the respect towards press seems to be different.
The government, the president holds press conferences, sometimes once a week, sometimes when she's got something to say. She talks to the press when she goes out and about to attend events. The premier, of course, he does the same thing. The government are pretty open about who they talk to. Saying that, of course, one-on-one interviews with certain government officials from the presidential office, for example, you still have to apply for them, of course. And, I have to say that sometimes they're not always willing to talk to certain people. The current government seems to put a lot of emphasis on talking to the international media, for example.
Right.
Obviously, it wants to get its points out to like the Associated Press, the Wall Street Journal, and various publications such as that, and the BBC, etc.
Okay. So, and I'd like to learn more about your newsroom environment. Can you let us know? I mean, it's an English language station, correct? What's the news cycle like with you guys? How does this work?
Well, obviously, because it's like a news cycle anywhere, I guess. You come in the morning, you do basically what happened late yesterday news, and it goes on, flows on through the day. But of course, the news cycle usually begins here with politics. Probably about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, we get the new news cycle stories about the politics, and that continues until 7 o'clock in the evening. Unless there's something major happening, which of course does occasionally happen, especially, for example, yesterday we had lawmakers beating themselves up or beating other people up outside the legislative UN, and that kicked off about 7 o'clock in the morning. So
wow. So it's a really tight ship that you guys run over there, correct?
That might be a bit of exaggeration, but I won't go into the truth there, so we say.
So we have a question that just came in. How well is the international media represented in Taiwan?
It's pretty, most of the major publications have people here or stringers here or correspondents here, whatever you want to call them. And recently, ever since when China actually sent away some US-based reporters, I believe from the New York Times and the Washington Post, several of them actually came here.
Wow.
Probably much to the chagrin of the reporters that are already here filing stories for them as basically stringers. So there's, we've got, although saying that, international wire services, Reuters still has quite a large office here. Bloomberg has quite a large office here. But the Associated Press's office here has sort of gone down over the years.
Is there a reason why?
Of course, let's start the early 2000s, late 90s. Of course, Taiwan was sort of the hub of the electronics sector hub. They had they have a big show for electronics every year called Computex. And of course, back then, Microsoft used to come here. They always used to come, all the big companies used to come here. So Taiwan was like, you could call it the center of the tech world, basically, right. Yeah. So, lots of wire services vis-a-vis business were here at the time. But of course, Taiwan's moved into the semiconductor world, and I guess semiconductors are a bit boring when it comes to flashy, glitzy pictures in newspapers and magazines. Of course, like I said, Bloomberg and Dow Jones do still have people here, and of course, the Nikkei still has people here.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, especially with this year, one of the main reasons why we started this talk is because once the pandemic hit, the concept of in-person meetings and for journalists to connect with sources and to do their work, a lot of them are foreign correspondents, the travel restrictions. I'd like to kind of tap into that with you to see how that's kind of affected the work that you're doing at the station. Has the pandemic, COVID-19, affected the way that you're doing your work? And if so, can you talk about that with us?
Well, of course, in Taiwan, we didn't really have the lockdowns that most other countries had for the whole, because the government obviously got its act together quite quickly, stopped people from coming in, and when people did come in, they quarantined them, which meant, I believe we had like 55 local transmissions of the coronavirus, and of course people had to wear masks. Social distancing was observed in some places, but of course so locally people could go out. Obviously, at government press conferences and government events, they did adhere to social distancing, and face masks were being worn. So it didn't really stop anyone from doing it. Locally, the reporting stayed pretty much the same. People in press conferences were sitting 3 chairs apart and wearing face masks rather than sitting next to each other and not wearing face masks.
Right.
But I guess that's got a lot to do with the fact that Taiwan wasn't as badly affected, like I said, with lockdowns as other countries.
Right. And then with your station in specific, and I wanted to know and tap into the World Health Organization and you guys' relation in gathering stories from who? They're 3 bad words in Taiwan. The World Health Organization. Yes. They don't really have a very good name here because of all that all kicked off when apparently they ignored Taiwan saying, hey, we can help. And they said, no, we don't need your help. And then, of course, there was the story,
And I'm going to call it a story because, of course, there's some conflict of interest or some controversy about whether the actual email was sent out, and if it was sent out, did it say what it was saying when Taiwan supposedly sent an email to the World Health Organization tipping them off about some disease in China that could be transmitted from human to human.
Right. And I believe Taiwan was blocked from participating in those talks by China, right, with the World Health Organization?
Taiwan was allowed to join the World Health Assembly for several years under the government of President Ma Ying-jeou, but when the new government got put into power, basically China kicked up a stink, stamped its feet and said, no more, go away. Right. But of course, saying that, you have to remember, there's a lot said about this, but saying that, I mean, every year Taiwan has sent health officials to Geneva who have held meetings with officials from other countries on the sidelines of the World Health Assembly.
Right.
So it hasn't been unable to talk. It hasn't been unable to talk to other countries' health officials. It can talk to them in something that a friend of mine basically calls it the pity party, which is a rather bad way to say it, but that's basically what it is. Taiwan still talks to health officials from other countries, I mean, quite high-ranking ones. I believe last year, they talked to the head US official when he was in Geneva. They talked to top European health officials. And of course, health officials from Taiwan's rather dwindling number of diplomatic allies, health officials in those countries also talk to directly.
Right, right. And so can you talk to us about, because for some people, if they don't know the relationship of what it means, why Taiwan has these relationships or lack of relationships with certain countries, what should they be focusing on as journalists if they're, during this time of COVID, it's difficult, obviously, to travel. So what kind of information could you give them to help them with their reporting, especially within incorporating what's going on in Taiwan?
Well, I can safely say this, in Taiwan at the moment, the coronavirus outbreak has pretty much diminished to the backs of people's minds because, like I said, we weren't hit hard by it. Of course, it still exists and there's still concern here because the government several weeks ago, the government opened up the airports here to transit passengers, basically, which means, so there was concern about transit passengers because they only interact with airport staff, but of course that caused concerns that, an airport staff personnel could get infected by it and of course go home with it and we could see localized infections then. To come in the country at the moment, only certain foreign, obviously Taiwanese nationals, ROC nationals, are allowed to come home. They have to go to quarantine, though, for 14 days and stay at home. Basically, if they have no symptoms of the virus, they stay at home for 14 days. If they have symptoms, they're hospitalized straight away. Foreign nationals, you have to have a residence permit to enter the country at the moment. And even then, again, like ROC citizens, if you have symptoms, you're hospitalized. If you don't have symptoms, you have to spend 14 days in quarantine.
Sorry about that. I just had a picture fall down.
No worries.
So can you tell us about the experience that you guys, or the journalists within Taiwan, and their relationship with China? Because I think that's an important element to kind of touch on and how that affects the reporting that you do within the country.
I think, well, a lot of the foreign journalists that come here, obviously they have to remain unbiased. They have to remain neutral, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So when they write their pieces for whoever they write their pieces for, they pretty much remain neutral. And they tell the story as it is. Yeah. But personally, when I know them, they have a very biased opinion, shall we say. There's there's a good and a bad in that story. And needless to say, where I'm sitting now is the good and the other is the bad.
Right. And
it's their personal take on that, though, not the way they write it.
And so for budding journalists that are getting into maybe foreign correspondent work and looking to cover objectively, right? What are some tips that you would give them when they're focusing on a region like this, where you're seeing that there is the dynamic of, the biases that you mentioned?
Again, use the remote control on your television and look at every news source and try to avoid the interweb.
Right.
But that's pretty much all I can say on that one.
Right. And what are some sources that you look into with when you're looking to look for news outside of Taiwan, like, for example, what's happening here in the US or what's happening in Europe? I
won't talk about what news sources I read about the US because that might offend some of the people that are tuning in. But needless to say, for the rest of the world, I usually look at the main one is the BBC, of course, being British, English, that's where I go to start with. The rest of the world, usually, I mean, Reuters, the Associated Press, which we get on the wire here in the office. But I find they're the best sources, of course.
Right.
And
right.
occasionally, if I want to look at what's happening in the, what you call it, mainstream media in the US, I will quickly look at the CNN website.
Right.
But that's about it.
So why do you think Americans or American journalists should care about what's going on in Taiwan?
There's a good question. Because, oh yeah, throw me on that. Why should people care about it? I guess because it's technically an ally of the United States of America. Technically an ally, an unrecognized, diplomatically wise ally of America. And of course, I mean, if you happen to, how to put this politely, if you happen to adhere to your current government's standing, then I guess Beijing is the enemy, which means that if Beijing is persecuting Taiwan, Taiwan is your friend.
Okay.
That's very basically put.
Right. And so when it comes to the coverage, what are some tips that you have that you think, I think right now, especially with what's been happening the past few months here in the States or maybe around the world, we're seeing so much of the angle with let's do coverage that involves COVID-19 or the pandemic. What kind of stories are you wanting to see kind of not get lost in the cracks when it comes to Taiwan that maybe will give a different angle for those that maybe don't have access to coming to the country? What would you recommend?
I guess, I mean, you could obviously try the government agencies. If you want a nitty gritty, you try the government agencies, which of course pump out their government propaganda, we'll call it for the sake of a word. Of course, the English language media about the native domestic English language media about Taiwan is rather limited. Of course, there are online publications such as Catagalan Media and New Bloom, and there are only 2 English language newspapers here, those being the Taipei Times and the Taiwan News. And that's basically it for English language media, domestic media in Taiwan. So I guess, you know, that's why technically the world is basically has to rely on. I've got a lot of correspondents here to pump out their stories about Taiwan. And of course, a lot of those stories recently have been how good Taiwan did vis-a-vis the coronavirus outbreak. And I should say these stories about how good Taiwan coped with the coronavirus outbreak started a couple of months ago. And I found that a bit odd because I thought maybe they would jump in the gun there. Of course, that reminded me of 1939 when an Englishman got off an aeroplane, waved a bit of paper around and said, "Peace in our time." Jump in the gun, I could have said at the time. And I still believe it might be jumping the gun a bit, you know.
Right. And in your history of the, like, I'll say 20 to 30 years maybe, of you being in Taiwan, were there ever any stories that you look back on that you reflect like, wow, this is something I'm very proud of in your career?
You're asking a personal question. I have no, I have none at all. It sounds stupid, but I'm like a Microsoft computer system. I empty my wastebasket every week, every day, and forget about it and move on. Because I think if you don't do that, if you're a journalist anywhere, if you don't actually do that, you know, you write one story about one topic on a Thursday, and the next Thursday you're writing about exactly the same thing, and all you do is get annoyed about writing about the same thing, repetitive. Because of course, like a lot of countries, stories here are repetitive. I host a show on the radio on Friday evenings. It's a commentary show. We talk about the news of the week with a couple of guests.
Right.
And, you know, for 3 months, I had to lead the show with the coronavirus.
Right.
And of course, you know, you do that for 3 weeks. It's like, oh, this is new, isn't it? Eh? But after 3 weeks, it's like you sit there with the guests and we're obviously not on air, not recorded. We're effing blind about how boring it is.
Right. So what are some things that you do to overcome these sorts of things? I mean, I don't want to call it burnout. Maybe it's like a burnout of the topic, right?
You move on to another story very quickly. One that you find funny.
Well, so for those that are, you know, like younger or at a lower level in a station, I mean, that could be a little intimidating. I mean, you're given an assignment and then you do it. So
well, you do the assignment. I guess you do the assignment, then you walk up to your boss and say, I've got this really funny story about mangoes. And you hope that your boss will say, okay, do the mango story.
So how important is that to build that relationship with either your boss or mentors? Is that something that you looked to when you were starting your career?
Me personally, no, because I speak my mind. So any of mine, No, I can't say that. No. I've no doubt irked a few of my bosses over the years, but that's the way it goes, I guess.
Okay, it looks like we have a question that just came in. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can pronounce the name. It's Yishuan Shi. We're going to unmute you, and then maybe you can help us pronounce your name as well, and then you can ask the question to Gavin. Let's see.
Hi, Gavin. My name is Yishan Shi.
Yishan Shi.
Yeah, I'm actually a Taiwanese, and I'm currently in the United States. So I just want you to ask, what do you think is the biggest difference between the news outlet in Taiwan and in America, in your own perspective?
In America, I'm not American. I shall say that. Like I said earlier, there's probably not a lot of difference. There's bias on both sides, if you see what I mean. Both countries have biased media. And if you look at American newspapers, they're owned by people who have an agenda, and the Taiwanese newspapers are owned by other people who have their own agendas. So to be honest with you, global media is all pretty much the same. Most of it's owned by rich people who have agendas. And that's the only way I can answer that. Of course, some of the agendas you might agree with, some of the agendas you might disagree with, but then you're going to pick which newspaper, which TV cable news station you want to watch, I guess.
Right. Thank you so much for your question. Reminder to everyone, we have about 10-15 more minutes left, so if you have any questions, please make sure to put them in the Q&A section. So, Gavin, why radio? Why did you go into radio at first? Or was that the first thing that you went into?
I began my career in print media.
Right.
Print media.
So how did that transition go from print over to radio?
As it was pointed out to me many, many years ago, with print media, you have to go out, you have to interview people, you have to go back to the office, you have to sit in front of your computer, and you have to write the story. I mean, be it 600 words or 1,500 words, you've basically spent a whole day writing a story. Now, in radio, you basically write the story in about 2 minutes, you read the story on the radio news, and it's over. So the answer is very simple. It's a lot quicker in radio than it is in print media.
Right. Is there anyone that you look to in the industry as a mentor or someone that you look up to?
No. I might be short, but I don't look up to anyone in that sense at all. No.
And when you first started, was there anyone that actually helped you through this process of transitioning from the print to radio? I'm sure you have people that you talk shop with, and
there was a chap who used to work here who I knew, and the reason I started working here was because of this one chap who sadly died several years ago. But he explained to me that, Gavin, you want to come and work at ICRT because it's the easiest job going, and that's why I started working here, because there's no other way to say that. That is how this Bill Thiessen explained it to me.
That's amazing. So with your radio show and everything that you're doing now, how are you able to, I mean, one thing that we've been asking all of our guests, because they all come from different parts of journalism world, right? Whether they're doing broadcast, photography, whatnot. Do you ever feel the burnout, or what are the things that you do to keep yourself sane in this crazy world that we live in, right?
When I go home, I don't look at the news. On Saturdays and Sundays, I don't look at the news. When I'm on holiday, I don't look at the news. I mean, the world could be going to poop in a basket, the kind of phrase. And if it's a Saturday or Sunday, I'm not going to give one damn. There you go. That's the simplest way to do it, really. Don't do it all the time. It's not anything, I guess, If you fix roads, you don't want to be fixing roads all the time. So, if you have to write stories about the news and follow the news, you don't want to be doing that all the time whatsoever. You have to tune out, turn off your wastebasket.
Right. So it's really important to kind of take that time to turn the switch off, correct?
I would phrase it as not give a damn, but some people find that some might find that phrase extreme, but never mind.
That's fantastic. So if there's any questions that we have for Gavin, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A section. We have a few more minutes left. Gavin, I really want to know, one thing we've been also asking all of our guests is, what does press mean to you, and why is it important?
Because I guess you have to tell the facts of the story without writing propaganda. Carry on.
No. So with press freedom, obviously it's really important, and as a global level in every country, we need to see that in order to see what kind of information we're getting from these various locations. And so for you in Taiwan, do you think that we're getting the information we need that's factual from Taiwan?
If someone gave me a map of the world and said, put pins in countries where the governments are that you actually trust and believe what they say, Taiwan will get a pretty big pin.
Okay.
Whereas other countries would get no pins whatsoever.
Do you mind talking about which countries wouldn't and why you think that?
Most of your people tuning in to your show are probably from one of those countries, but never mind, there you go. So maybe we shouldn't go down that road.
Okay, we have another question coming in from Charles. Dan, can we unmute? Hi,
Sure.
Charles.
Hi, this is Charles Gerber. Do you have any stories that you want to focus upon and or that you feel are not sufficiently covered?
In Taiwan, it's such a small island, obviously, and there's such an abundance of print media, broadcast media, radio, and of course the internet media. Pretty much everything is covered because, of course, you get the local cable TV channels, so of course blanket coverage 24 hours a day. They even pick up, of course, like in every other country, they're now running the interweb stories that people on the internet are running. So I have to say that most everything is covered on this island, A, because it's so small, and B, because basically everyone's sharing everything, as I'm sure you know if you work in media. It's one of the things here, obviously, if a famous American publication, newspaper, for example, writes a story, I can't, off the top of my head, the price of mangoes in Taiwan has plummeted, then of course other international media outlets are going to want the same story. If you see what I mean, it's like the coronavirus story. We had, somebody originally wrote that Taiwan has done really well during the coronavirus story, but then of course every other international media outlet had to basically write the same story over and over and over and over again, just with different interviews, and of course with a different lead. That was a big thing.
All right. Thank you, Charles, for your question. We have another one. How are people in Taiwan reacting to the US government in general, or can you pick a topic to comment on?
How are the people? I would say the average person in Taiwan reacting to the American government. Let me ask my chap over here, who's the tech guy, who's a local guy. So Simon, how are you reacting to the US government? Any comment? No. He has no comment. So the average person on the street here, I would say, doesn't really care, is a bit of a strong word, doesn't really react to what the US government's doing. They might look at the headlines which say the US government's selling Taiwan a bunch of weapons systems, and they'll probably nod and go, hey, that's good. But of course, if you're in the government, you're going to make a big thing of it. You're going to blow it up to be this huge thing, which you've got here at the moment. We had this thing, Donald Trump got elected the president of America, and it was all blown up in certain media here that Donald Trump was the greatest thing since sliced bread to happen to Taiwan ever. Of course, and of course the public were talking about Donald Trump. But, I would say the way that the public here is talking about Donald Trump when he was voted in, and of course President Tsai Ing-wen spoke to him on the telephone, which was a plus. That got out there. But I presume that people in Taiwan have the same opinions, if not lesser opinions of Donald Trump than other parts of the world.
Amazing. Thank you for your question. So for journalists that are starting out, what are some tips that you would give them as to be successful and have a long career in journalism?
Think about a career change.
Career change. What should they get into as opposed to journalism then?
I don't know. I've always wanted to get into something I work outside. Farming work has always attracted me, or it has attracted me in recent years.
That's amazing.
Because I guess nowadays it's more difficult to get into it, I guess, because obviously newspapers are closing all over the world,
right,
due to financial things, due to advertising, etc. And of course, cable television, news channels, you've got to be experienced or get an internship at one of them, so they're not difficult to get anymore. So I guess, some people I know who have not got into journalism, they've bunked out of journalism to go to the internet. They've done internet journalism, which I guess if you get a bunch of people reading or looking at your videos is a good thing because you get money. The YouTube will pay you money.
Right.
And you can set up your own website to publish your own news. So I guess it's a bit different now, but I guess maybe there's more opportunities in a way because of the internet, but less opportunities in a way because of the closure of many newspapers, both local and national. Because once upon a time, you know, the US, every town, every county in the United States would have had its own local newspaper, which means
Right.
and they would have been owned by individuals who either lived in those towns or, you know, were a resident in the area. But nowadays, of course, in the US, many of the local newspapers are being bought by larger conglomerate newspapers that are state-owned or even country-owned, nationally owned, which means that you're losing that opportunity, that job opportunity for people to move into print journalism.
Right. So we're nearing the end of our talk. I want to make sure if anyone else has questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A section. I have a question for you. What is your take on when you hear, well, everyone now can be a journalist if they have a cell phone, or, you know, with the access to technology that we have? How does that make you feel with your extensive career and everything you've been through?
How does everyone can be a journalist because we have cell phones to make me feel? Well, if you've ever read the rubbish that gets written on the internet by people who claim to be journalists, I guess then it just makes you laugh. There was an incident several years ago where the AP, the Associated Press news cameraman here, television, AP news guy, there was something happened and he had to shoot off to some part of Taiwan to go and film it. And of course they didn't have a reporter with him. And they said they want some photographs of the incident, like very quickly, like now. And he was like, well, I'm filming it. I've got to sit down. I've got to cut the film out and I'll give you a still. And they were like, no, take a photo with your camera. This was a news TV cameraman. And he told me this story with such venom that he was so insulted that he had to use his telephone to take a photograph for the Associated Press. He was rather peeved about it.
So do you think it's changing the atmosphere a little bit when it comes to journalism, having access to these sorts of things? Do you think that if there's journalists that are recently graduating, getting into the field, should they be thinking about, you know, learning one thing or becoming a jack of all trades and using those mobile?
Nowadays, you have to become a
jack and Jill of all trades.
Yeah. Nowadays, you have to become a person of all trades, be it
Right.
a male or a female person of all trades. Another example, I mean, obviously, photographers I know, photographers I've worked here over the years. Of course, they all started in print media. They were rushing to the studio to develop their photographs on film. They were scanning the negatives to put them in the newspaper. Then, of course, it went digital. So they were buying, like, I don't know, 200 megabit cards for their phones to start with, where you could put 10 photos or something ridiculous on them. And of course, they moved on to bigger and better cameras. And of course, most of them have now had to move into videography. Basically, they've got to move into video now because video is the new thing. So still pictures to video.
Right. The transition.
Yeah. And lots of them have made that transition.
Right.
Some more successfully than others, I should say, without naming any names.
Amazing. So we're nearing the end of our talk. If there's anyone that has any questions, please let us know. Gavin, it went by so fast, the hour, and
it's only 8 for what time we are? Oh, okay. Is it an hour?
Yeah, it's been, we have like a few more minutes left. And I just really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, I want to ask you one more question before we end it off and announce our next talks. But what is your take, being in the radio, what's your take on the podcast world and how it's potentially growing? I mean, are you seeing an audience in Taiwan when it comes to podcasts? Is that something you guys think about?
Actually, we've had we podcast. Well, ICRT has many podcasts of shows, but the current affairs show I host on Fridays on the radio has been podcasted over 5 years now. And when we first started podcasting it in Taiwan, this is 5 years ago. Podcasting wasn't very big here at all. I mean, there was very few local. You'd look, for example, you know, I had an iPad at the time, and I'd go to the Apple podcast app, yeah, and I'd see, you know, our podcasts were in the top 20, the top 10, and there was very few other local podcasts there at all. But now, if I open my Apple podcast app, I see that, you know, there's dozens and dozens, if not scores, of Taiwan podcasts about everything ranging from like sex positions to cooking.
Right,
So
right.
it's podcasting has exploded in Taiwan over the past 5 years, and then, like I said, a wide range of topics. But still,
Amazing.
if you look at the basically the iTunes or Apple podcast app, you'll get a good mix of foreign, like CNN, other things are there, other international podcasts are there, but also a lot of local podcasts are there now.
Oh, that's really good. So it seems like the local folks in Taiwan are looking to that medium to get their news, correct?
I don't know about news, like I said,
Or just in general?
there are some, if you look at the top podcasts, they're not usually news. They're usually people that are in the media, famous local people in the media, talking about something, or famous people that work in what would you call it, in real estate, in feng shui, all
Right.
doing their own podcasts, and putting it out there and becoming even more well known than they already were.
Wow. Amazing. It seems to be the same case globally, right? I mean, I think that industry has a lot of potential of growth. So,
And I mean, because you can sell advertising on podcasts, so people can make a bit of money on podcasts, I guess. Although, I don't see anybody that runs a podcast driving a Rolls Royce down the street, or a Ferrari for that matter.
that's amazing. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we finish up the conversation?
No. Obviously, I've probably completely bored the people that are listening, so I shall go away and have my breakfast.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And
No worries, it was a pleasure.
such a lively, amazing conversation. I wanted to make sure for those that are attending to announce our talks that are taking place in the next few weeks. On July 21st, we have Sanford Younger. He was the 24th Voice of America director, and he served from 1999 to 2001. He's currently director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. I'm really excited to have him and look forward to having you all join us on the 21st. On the 28th of July, we have the World Affairs Council's Bill Clifford and the executive director of the Montana World Affairs Council, Chris Hislop. So please join us for that. We're looking forward to talking with them. Next week, we'll also announce our August lineup. So we're looking forward to having you all there. And thank you, Gavin, for joining us. It was an amazing
It was a pleasure.
conversation.
It was better than reading the news. Someone else had to do that this morning. So there you go.
We'll give you a little break, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you and have a wonderful morning. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you all next week.